In Plague-era London, the concept of a night out existed in a form that would be almost unrecognizable today, and probably medically inadvisable. This was a city where clean drinking water was a rumor, sanitation was more of a suggestion, and alcohol was not a luxury but a daily survival strategy. People did not drink because they were celebrating. They drank because it was safer than the river, more predictable than milk, and cheaper than hope. Ale, beer, and later gin were consumed from morning to night by adults, children, laborers, priests, and anyone else who could lift a cup without immediately collapsing. Sobriety was rare, suspicious, and occasionally dangerous. London's streets during this period were narrow, muddy, and generously coated with the byproducts of human and animal life. Waste flowed freely, often downhill, sometimes into basements, sometimes into open drains, and frequently onto shoes. The Thames, which technically served as the city's main water source, doubled as a sewer, a dumping ground, and a convenient place to toss things no one wanted to think about again. Drinking straight from it was possible, but not recommended if you valued having all your organs continue functioning in their original order. Alcohol, by contrast, went through boiling during production. This made it marginally safer, which was enough to turn beer into a staple food. A weak ale, known as small beer, was consumed daily, even by children, because it would not immediately give them dysentery. It also had the side benefit of making long, unpleasant workdays feel slightly shorter and less emotionally demanding. In a city where plague outbreaks could appear without warning, mild intoxication became part of the background noise of life. Taverns were everywhere. They were warm, crowded, dimly lit spaces where people gathered to drink, argue, cough, and exchange rumors about who had died this week. A night in a tavern involved shared cups, shared benches, shared air, and shared diseases. No one knew what bacteria were, but everyone understood that being indoors with 50 strangers breathing heavily into wooden walls was simply how socializing worked. The plague did not politely excuse itself from these gatherings. It attended regularly and without invitation. When the plague arrived, it did not shut down taverns. If anything, drinking increased. Fear made people thirsty, and alcohol was one of the few comforts available. Many Londoners believed strong drink could ward off disease by cleansing the body. Others drank because if death was nearby, it seemed rude not to meet it slightly buzzed. Medical advice of the time did not strongly discourage this thinking. Doctors themselves often prescribed alcohol, herbs, and optimism in varying proportions. The result was a city where sickness and drunkenness coexisted peacefully. People staggered through streets carrying tankards while plague carts rolled past, collecting bodies wrapped in cloth. It was not uncommon for someone to feel ill, assume it was a hangover, and then discover it was something far more final. In London's drunken plague era, the line between a bad night and a fatal one was thin, poorly marked, and frequently ignored. Public health measures were minimal, quarantines were unevenly enforced, and poorer neighborhoods were often left to manage themselves. These were also the areas with the highest concentration of alehouses. Overcrowding, poor nutrition, and constant drinking created ideal conditions for disease to spread slowly, quietly, and efficiently. People did not stop drinking when the plague came. They simply drank in slightly darker rooms, with slightly fewer friends. From a modern perspective, it is tempting to view this period as chaotic or reckless. In reality, it was deeply practical. Alcohol was familiar. It was available. It made life in a filthy, dangerous city marginally more tolerable. Londoners were not ignorant. They were adapting with the tools they had. Those tools just happened to include a lot of fermented grain. So, if you imagine yourself surviving a night out in plague-era London, it helps to lower your expectations. You would drink because everyone else was drinking. You would share space with strangers because there was nowhere else to go. And you would go to sleep not knowing whether tomorrow would bring another hangover, another outbreak, or nothing at all. In this way, London drifted through its drunken plague years slowly, quietly, and very, very tired. Over time, this constant, low-level intoxication shaped the rhythm of the city. London did not move quickly. It shuffled, paused, leaned against walls, and occasionally sat down without planning to. Work was done at a pace that allowed for frequent drinking, because frequent drinking was unavoidable. Laborers drank before starting their day, during breaks, and after finishing, not as indulgence but as routine maintenance. To be fully alert in plague-era London would have meant noticing too much. The smells, the coughing, the number of funerals. Alcohol softened the edges. The smell of the city deserves quiet mention. London smelled like damp wood, rotting food, smoke, sweat, animal waste, and unwashed bodies layered over years of poor drainage. Alahouses did not improve this situation, but they masked it slightly. The scent of spilled beer and smoke was, in its own way, comforting. It suggested familiarity. People knew what beer smelled like. They did not know what plague smelled like until it was too late. During outbreaks, official advice often included avoiding bad air, which was difficult in a city made almost entirely of bad air. Taverns were hotbeds of this problem. Low ceilings trapped smoke and breath. Windows were small or non-existent. Yet these places remained open because they were essential social infrastructure. Closing taverns would have removed one of the few remaining comforts people had. In a society without entertainment, without reliable medicine, and without clear explanations, alcohol functioned as a social glue and a mild sedative. Gin entered the picture more aggressively in later periods, but even before that, stronger spirits gained popularity during times of stress. They were cheaper, faster, and more effective at numbing fear. Entire neighborhoods developed reputations for constant drunkenness, though it was less a moral failure and more a survival pattern. When death was common and unpredictable, planning for the future lost its appeal. Drinking was immediate. The plague was immediate. Long-term thinking could wait, or more often, never arrived. Women drank alongside men, especially among the working poor. Children drank weak beer. There was little stigma, because there was little alternative. Clean water infrastructure would not meaningfully improve for centuries. Milk spoiled quickly. Tea required boiling water, which required fuel. Beer simply arrived, already prepared, already warm, already acceptable. In plague-era logic, that was efficiency. As death tolls rose, so did superstition. Some believed certain drinks could prevent infection. Others added herbs, spices, or vinegar to their alcohol, hoping for protection. None of this worked, but it provided the illusion of control. Drinking became ritualized. A certain cup before bed, a certain ale in the morning. Small habits offered structure in a world where bodies disappeared overnight. Plague doctors, when they appeared, did little to discourage this behavior. Their masks, their robes, their strange instruments did not inspire confidence. If anything, they reinforced the sense that no one really knew what was happening. In that environment, trusting a familiar mug of ale felt reasonable. It had not killed you yesterday. That was considered strong evidence. Funerals became shorter. Grief became quieter. People learned not to react too strongly to loss, because reacting took energy. Alcohol helped flatten emotional peaks. It allowed people to function without fully processing what they were living through. This emotional dulling was not celebrated, but it was effective. London endured by becoming numb. From a distance, the drunken plague era looks bleak, and it was, but it was also remarkably stable. The city did not collapse. People continued, working, trading, drinking, and sleeping. Life shrank to manageable routines. Drink, work, cough, sleep, repeat. In this sense, alcohol was not excess, it was infrastructure. So when we say you would not survive a night out in plague-era London, it is not because of one dramatic moment. It is because survival required constant adaptation to discomfort, fear, and illness. A single night blended into many others, each one slightly worse, slightly quieter. And in that slow, dim rhythm, London persisted, drunk, sick, exhausted, and somehow still standing. By the later stages of repeated outbreaks, Londoners developed a strange familiarity with catastrophe. The plague was no longer a shocking interruption. It was a background condition, like rain or poor lighting. People stopped asking when it would end and focused instead on how to get through the week. Alcohol helped with that adjustment. It made uncertainty feel less sharp. It blurred the sense of time. Days melted together, which was convenient when every day looked roughly the same. Records from the period show that alehouses often stayed open even when nearby homes were sealed shut due to infection. Red crosses appeared on doors. Watchmen stood outside, ensuring no one escaped. A few steps away, inside a tavern, people drank shoulder to shoulder. pretending the crosses were someone else's problem. This was not denial so much as triage. You could not grieve everyone. You could not fear constantly. You could drink. The economics of drinking mattered too. Brewing employed people. Taverns generated taxes. Shutting them down would have created new problems at exactly the wrong time. Authorities tolerated heavy drinking because it kept the city functioning. A drunk laborer still worked. A drunk dockhand still unloaded ships. A sober, starving one might riot. In this way, alcohol became quietly political. It maintained order by lowering expectations. There were, of course, consequences. Accidents were common. Arguments escalated quickly. Fires broke out in cramped neighborhoods where alahouses used open flames and careless patrons. People fell into the Thames with impressive regularity. These deaths were noted, if at all, as unfortunate but unremarkable. When plague deaths numbered in the thousands, an individual drowning barely registered. Religious leaders occasionally preached moderation, but even they understood the limits of persuasion. Sermons competed with hunger, fear, and exhaustion. Heaven was distant. Ale was immediate. Many churches were surrounded by taverns, creating a convenient spiritual loop. Sin inside, repentance later, repeat as necessary. The plague did not appear to punish this behavior selectively, which undermined moral arguments against it. As generations passed, stories accumulated. People remembered which outbreaks were worse, which years emptied streets, which drinks were associated with survival, even if only coincidentally. Memory blurred into folklore. A certain ale became lucky. A certain tavern was avoided. None of this altered the course of disease, but it gave people something to believe in besides statistics they did not have. From the outside, it might seem irrational to gather, drink, and share air during a deadly epidemic. From the inside, it felt normal. Humans are good at normalizing danger when danger is constant. Plague-era London normalized it with alcohol. The city dulled itself just enough to keep going. Eventually, outbreaks subsided. Not because of drinking, but because of slow changes in immunity, population movement, and later, sanitation. By the time cleaner water and better infrastructure arrived, the habit of drinking was already deeply embedded in urban life. London's relationship with alcohol outlived the plague by centuries. What began as necessity hardened into culture. So when you imagine that night out in plague-era London, it helps to imagine the morning after. You would wake up in a cramped room. Your head would hurt. Your throat would be dry. Outside, carts might be passing, or not. Someone you spoke to last night might be gone, or they might be drinking again already. Life would continue without asking your permission. Survival was not dramatic. It was not heroic. It was repetitive, uncomfortable, and slightly intoxicated. London did not defeat the plague in a single moment. It endured it slowly, one drink at a time, one exhausted day after another. And in that dull persistence, the city wrote a quiet, grim chapter of history that, if you are lucky, you only ever need to hear about while falling asleep. As the city carried on, routines became smaller and more inward-facing. People stopped thinking in terms of years, or even months. Time was measured by outbreaks, by funerals, by how long a particular tavern keeper remained alive. Alcohol fit neatly into this compressed sense of time. A drink marked the start of the day, another marked the end. Anything beyond that was uncertain and therefore not worth planning for. Homes offered little refuge. Many were single rooms shared by entire families, sometimes with lodgers, animals, or both. Ventilation was poor. Privacy barely existed. If someone fell ill, everyone noticed, but there was rarely anywhere else to go. Taverns, by contrast, felt spacious even when crowded. At least there was noise, warmth, and the comfort of others pretending things were normal. For many, the alehouse was less a place of celebration and more a second living room with worse furniture and better distractions. Medical understanding remained limited and contradictory. Some physicians warned against excess drinking, while others encouraged it as a way to strengthen the body or lift the spirits. No one could offer consistent results. People paid attention instead to experience. They noticed who drank and survived, who abstained and died, and drew conclusions accordingly. These conclusions were rarely accurate, but they were emotionally persuasive. In uncertain times, anecdotes carried more weight than advice. Children grew up quickly in this environment. They learned early that sickness was common and that adults drank often. Small beer became part of daily meals, not as a vice, but as nourishment. Childhood was quieter, shorter, and less sentimental. There was little space for prolonged innocence when entire households could vanish in a week. Alcohol, diluted and ordinary, was simply another part of growing up. Despite everything, the city retained a strange sense of humor. Jokes were dark, understated, and often made over drinks. Laughter did not mean happiness, it meant endurance. Sarcasm flourished. If you could joke about the plague, you could live with it. Alcohol loosened tongues just enough to allow this shared coping mechanism to function. A grim comment exchanged across a table could feel like solidarity. At night, the city settled into an uneasy quiet. Curfews were sometimes imposed, sometimes ignored. Watchmen patrolled streets that smelled of smoke and damp stone. Inside taverns, candles burned low. People drank more slowly, talking less. Fatigue replaced fear. Eventually, one by one, patrons drifted home or collapsed where they sat. Sleep came easily after enough alcohol. Whether one woke up again was a separate matter. The plague years did not end with a clear conclusion. They faded. Fewer carts, fewer crosses, slightly more noise in the streets. Drinking patterns barely changed. If anything, survival reinforced them. People who had lived through outbreaks trusted what had gotten them through. The idea of giving up alcohol did not feel like progress. It felt risky. Looking back, it is tempting to assign lessons or moral judgments. But Plague-era London was not a cautionary tale in the way modern audiences expect. It was not about excess leading to downfall. It was about adaptation under pressure. Alcohol was not the cause of survival, but it was part of how people coped with conditions they could not control. So when we speak of London's drunken plague era, it is important to strip away drama. There were no grand nights, no legendary parties, no romanticized chaos. There were tired people, drinking quietly, trying to make another day feel manageable. The danger was constant, the comfort minimal, and the solutions imperfect. If you were there, you would not think of it as history. You would think of it as Tuesday. You would drink because the cup was there. You would sleep because you were exhausted. And you would wake up, if you did, ready to repeat the process without much reflection. That is how London survived, not through brilliance or bravery, but through habit, through routine, through small, dull comforts, applied repeatedly over time. A city slightly drunk, perpetually weary, and stubbornly alive. And if that sounds unimpressive, that is because survival often is quiet, unremarkable, and best remembered at a distance, preferably while you are lying down, eyes closed, and drifting slowly away. In the long aftermath, once the worst waves had passed, London did not celebrate. There were no banners, no collective sigh of relief. The city simply noticed that fewer people were missing. Streets felt slightly less hollow. Taverns filled a bit more consistently, though no one commented on it directly. Commenting would have required admitting how fragile everything still felt. Silence was safer. Those who survived carried quiet habits forward, drinking at certain hours, sitting in certain corners, avoiding certain streets without fully remembering why. Trauma did not announce itself. It settled in gently, disguised as routine. Alcohol remained part of that routine, not because the plague demanded it anymore, but because the body remembered needing it. Habits formed in crisis rarely dissolve on their own. London rebuilt slowly, unevenly. New buildings rose beside old ones that still smelled faintly of sickness and smoke. Taverns were repaired, expanded, renamed, but never truly replaced. They remained gathering points, information hubs, places where news traveled faster than official announcements. Drinking continued to smooth over uncertainty. Even in healthier times, the city preferred its edges softened. Looking back through records, it is difficult to separate cause from coincidence. Did people drink because life was unbearable, or did life feel unbearable because it was soaked in alcohol? The truth, as usual, is dull. It was both, and neither, and mostly irrelevant to those living it. People did not analyze their coping mechanisms. They used them. What stands out most is how ordinary everything remained. There was no single night when the city collapsed into chaos. There was no singular moment of redemption, just a long sequence of evenings that looked much like the ones before. The plague did not demand drama, it required endurance. Alcohol helped provide that, in small, repetitive doses. For modern listeners, imagining this period can feel distant and unreal. The smells, the sounds, the constant low-level fear do not translate easily, but the emotional landscape is familiar. Uncertainty, fatigue, the quiet urge to make the present moment slightly easier, even if tomorrow remains unclear. Plague-era London simply lacked healthier tools to achieve that. So, when we say you would not survive a night out in Plague-era London, it is less a warning than an observation. Survival depended on tolerance, for discomfort, for loss, for routines that dulled the mind just enough to keep it functioning. One night was never just one night. It was part of a long chain, each link worn smooth by repetition. In the end, the city outlasted the plague, not by overcoming fear, but by living alongside it, by drinking, by working, by sleeping when possible, by not asking too many questions when answers were unavailable. This was not wisdom, it was pragmatism. And that is perhaps the quiet lesson of London's drunken plague era. History is not always shaped by great decisions or dramatic turning points. Sometimes it is shaped by tired people choosing the least painful option available, again and again, until time itself moves on. So as you listen to this story, safely removed from the smells and the sickness, it is worth remembering how unremarkable survival can look from the inside. No heroics, no clarity, just another cup, another evening, another day endured. If your eyes are heavy now, that feels appropriate. This is not a story meant to keep you awake. It is a reminder that most of history happened slowly, quietly, and without asking for attention. Much like sleep itself, it arrived gradually. And once it did, the city, for the moment, finally rested. Even rest, when it came, was light and easily broken. Sleep in Plague-era London was not the deep, restorative kind people imagine. It was shallow, interrupted by coughing, shouting, carts on cobblestones, and the occasional bell announcing another death. Alcohol helped push the body into unconsciousness, but it did not promise peace. Dreams were often unpleasant. Waking was worse. Still, sleep happened, because exhaustion eventually wins every argument. Morning arrived without ceremony. Light crept through narrow windows, revealing rooms unchanged from the night before. Cups left out, clothes not removed, the smell of stale drink mixing with damp air. People woke slowly, checked their bodies for signs of illness, and decided whether they were well enough to stand. If they were, the day continued. If they were not, someone else noticed eventually. There was no time for prolonged concern. Markets reopened even during outbreaks. Food still had to be bought, sold, carried, cooked. Drinking often began again before noon, not to celebrate survival, but to steady shaking hands and quiet anxious thoughts. A mild buzz was considered functional. Complete sobriety was uncomfortable. It made the body too aware of itself. Social bonds adjusted accordingly. Friendships became looser, less demanding. People stopped expecting consistency. Someone might vanish for weeks and return thinner, quieter, alive, or not return at all. No explanations were required. Alcohol softened these transitions. A nod across a table was enough acknowledgement. Words were optional. There was little space for nostalgia. The past was either irrelevant or painful. The future was abstract. The present was managed in small increments. Drink helped narrow focus to what was immediately in front of you: the cup, the bench, the warmth of bodies nearby. This narrowing was not accidental. It was adaptive. Thinking too broadly was dangerous. Authority figures drifted in and out of relevance. Orders were given, ignored, half followed. Taverns remained reliable in a way institutions were not. You knew where they were. You knew what they offered. You knew the rules: pay, drink, sit, leave. Predictability mattered more than virtue. Occasionally, someone decided to stop drinking. These attempts were rarely announced and seldom lasted. Without alcohol, the city felt sharper, louder, more hostile. The smells returned in full force. The fear had no buffer. Most people quietly resumed. There was no shame in this. Shame required moral clarity, and moral clarity was a luxury. As years passed, children who had known nothing else grew into adults. For them, the drunken rhythm of the city was normal. Stories of earlier, healthier times sounded exaggerated, almost fictional. The idea that water could be trusted felt suspicious. Beer felt safer because it was familiar. Culture followed necessity, and necessity lingered even after danger receded. Eventually, changes arrived. Slowly. New building practices, better waste management in limited areas, slight improvements in water access. None of this happened overnight, and none of it erased habits immediately. The city carried its old coping mechanisms forward, long after their original purpose faded. Alcohol stayed. When historians later described this era, they searched for meaning. They counted deaths, tracked outbreaks, analyzed responses. What they struggled to capture was the texture of daily life, the dullness, the repetition, the quiet resignation. These things do not show up neatly in records. They live in between entries, in the spaces where nothing dramatic happened. London's drunken plague era was not defined by wild excess. It was defined by moderation taken to an extreme. Just enough drink to function, just enough distance from fear to keep moving, just enough routine to prevent collapse. It was survival stripped of romance. So, if you are imagining yourself there, do not picture chaos, picture fatigue. Picture people doing the same small things every day, even when those things no longer made sense. Picture a city too tired to panic, too busy enduring to reflect. And if this story feels repetitive, that is accurate. History, as lived, often is. It loops, it dulls, it wears grooves into behavior, until those grooves become culture. Plague-era London survived, not by changing quickly, but by changing very slowly, almost accidentally. At some point, without anyone noticing exactly when, the city moved on. Not cleanly, not completely, just enough. The taverns remained, the drinking remained, the memory of fear faded into background noise. Life expanded again, cautiously, unevenly. That is how it ended. Not with relief, but with habit outlasting crisis. A city waking up one morning and realizing it had already survived, and then, without much thought, pouring another drink and continuing on. By the time the city realized the plague had loosened its grip, the habits formed during its worst years were already permanent. Drinking was no longer a response to crisis. It was simply part of being in London. Alehouses blended into the landscape as naturally as churches or markets. They were not discussed, they were assumed. People moved through them with the ease of routine. You entered, you nodded, you drank, you left. No one asked how you were coping, because coping was no longer a topic. It was implied by your continued presence. If you were there, you were managing well enough. That was the standard. Those who had lost family rarely spoke of it in detail. Grief had been compressed into something quieter and more durable. Alcohol did not erase memory, but it blurred the edges enough to make remembrance tolerable. Pain became less sharp, more distant. This was not healing in a modern sense. It was adaptation. The body learned what the mind could not articulate. London itself carried scars that were easy to ignore once you stopped looking closely. Empty plots where houses once stood, streets widened accidentally by fire or collapse, neighborhoods that never fully repopulated. The city adjusted around these gaps without commentary. Life flowed past absence as if it had always been there. Travelers passing through sometimes remarked on London's drinking culture. They described it as excessive, gloomy, or strangely subdued. Londoners rarely argued. Explaining would have required revisiting years best left unexamined. It was easier to let outsiders misunderstand. They had not lived through it. They did not need to. Public memory softened over time. The plague became something that had happened, not something that shaped behavior daily. Stories grew less specific. Dates blurred. Numbers lost meaning. What remained was atmosphere. A sense that life was uncertain, comfort was temporary, and endurance mattered more than ambition. Alcohol fit neatly into that worldview. Even celebrations carried restraint. Weddings were modest. Holidays passed without spectacle. Excessive joy felt risky, almost tempting fate. Drinking continued, but rarely with enthusiasm. It was steady, reliable, almost administrative, a way to mark time without drawing attention to it. Work resumed its familiar patterns. Trades rebuilt, commerce expanded, yet the pace remained cautious. People preferred small gains to big risks. The memory of sudden loss discouraged boldness. Alcohol helped maintain this balance. It kept emotions level. It discouraged extremes. As generations turned over, children inherited behaviors without context. They drank because their parents did. They gathered in taverns because that was where people gathered. The original reasons were no longer discussed. Culture does not require explanation once it is established. It only requires repetition. Looking back now, it is tempting to frame this era as a failure of public health or leadership. Those judgments are not wrong, but they miss something essential. The people of Plague-era London were not making choices in a vacuum. They were responding to conditions with limited tools. Alcohol was one of those tools. Imperfect, harmful at times, but available. What makes this period quietly unsettling is how familiar it feels. The instinct to numb discomfort, to rely on routine, to accept ongoing risk as background noise. These are not ancient behaviors. They are human ones. London simply experienced them early, intensely, and without better alternatives. So, if you imagine yourself there, at the very end of the plague years, you would not feel relief. You would feel tired. You would feel older than you expected to. You would drink, not to forget, but to settle, to mark the evening, to make the transition into sleep smoother. And when you lay down, surrounded by a city that had learned to survive without ever feeling safe, you might not think of history at all. You would think of tomorrow's work, of whether the tavern would be open, of whether the coughing outside would stop before morning. That is how it ends, not with clarity, not with closure, just with continuation. A city moving forward because stopping was never an option. A population shaped by disease and drink, carrying both quietly into the future. If you are drifting now, that is appropriate. This is not a story meant to demand attention. It is meant to fade gently, the way most of it did, into habit, into routine, into sleep. Eventually, even the idea of the plague years became a shorthand rather than a lived memory. People referred to them vaguely, the way one refers to a long winter or a difficult job from long ago. Details were unnecessary. Everyone knew what was meant. It had been hard. People had endured. That was sufficient. London continued to grow, slowly filling in the spaces left behind. New residents arrived who had not experienced the worst of it. They learned the city's habits without learning their origins. They drank because that was what Londoners did. They gathered indoors because the weather, the streets, and tradition all encouraged it. The past lingered, but quietly, embedded in behavior rather than stories. Alahouses remained places of low expectations. No one arrived hoping for transformation. They arrived hoping for relief. A pause. A moment where the body could sit, the mind could dull, and the world could be held at arm's length. This was not despair. It was maintenance. What historians sometimes miss is how little people want to be brave. Bravery is loud. It draws attention. Most people in Plague-era London wanted the opposite. They wanted to be unnoticed, to pass through days without incident. Alcohol helped make one less noticeable, both to others and to oneself. There was no grand moral lesson circulating at the time, no collective vow to do better. Improvement, when it came, arrived through infrastructure and time, not reflection. Sewers were built, water sources improved, medical knowledge advanced slowly. Drinking habits remained, because habits do not dissolve simply because their original justification disappears. From the inside, survival felt passive. People did not feel resilient. They felt worn down. Endurance did not feel noble. It felt inevitable. You got up because you had not died. You drank because it was there. You slept because eventually you could not stay awake. That cycle did not feel like history being made. It felt like Tuesday. Even in later, healthier generations, London retained a certain restraint, a tendency toward understatement, a preference for coping quietly rather than dramatically. It is not entirely accurate to blame this on the plague, but it is also not wrong to see a connection. Long exposure to uncertainty trains people to lower their expectations. So when modern audiences hear about London's drunken plague era, they often expect chaos, madness, or spectacle. What they would find instead is monotony. Long evenings, dim rooms, people drinking without enthusiasm, conversations that trailed off, laughter that faded quickly, a city conserving energy. If you were there at the very end, when the danger had eased but memory had not, you might notice how careful everyone still was, how quickly doors closed at night, how drinking continued without celebration, how comfort was allowed, but only in small doses. Excess felt unwise. Silence felt safer. And then, slowly, without anyone marking the moment, the city changed. Not because it decided to, but because enough time passed. Enough new people arrived. Enough old habits lost their urgency. The plague receded into records. The drinking remained, stripped of its original purpose, but not its place. This is often how history works, not through endings, but through fading. The things that shaped daily life stop being discussed long before they stop being felt. By the time people feel safe enough to analyze the past, it is already distant. So if you imagine yourself lying down now, listening to this account, it may feel unsatisfying that nothing dramatic resolves it. There is no final night, no last drink, no clear line between crisis and normality. That absence is accurate. London did not wake up one morning cured. It woke up one morning unchanged, and then repeated that process until change happened quietly in the background. Survival did not announce itself. It accumulated. And that, perhaps, is why this story works best as something you fall asleep to. It mirrors the way it unfolded. Slowly, repetitively, without demanding attention. A long stretch of time where people did what they could with what they had, and then went on. If your thoughts are drifting now, that is fitting. This history does not need to be remembered sharply. It existed in blur, in routine, in small comforts repeated until they became culture. London survived its drunken plague era not by learning a lesson, but by getting tired enough that endurance became automatic. And when the danger finally loosened its grip, the city barely noticed. It simply kept going. That is where we leave it. Not at a conclusion, but at a continuation. A city moving forward because it always had. And if sleep arrives quietly as this does, then it is doing exactly what it should. In the quiet that followed, London settled into something that looked like normal, even if it felt thinner than before. People went about their days without checking the air for danger quite so often. They still coughed. They still drank. They still avoided thinking too far ahead. But the urgency had softened, like a bruise finally fading after being ignored for too long. The city learned not to rush back into confidence. Confidence had proven unreliable. Instead, London favored steadiness, small routines, familiar paths, taverns that opened and closed at the same hours every day, offering the comfort of predictability. A drink did not promise happiness. It promised consistency. In a place shaped by disruption, that mattered. Memories of the plague became selective. People remembered what was useful and forgot what was not. They remembered which streets to avoid in certain weather, which buildings felt untrustworthy, which taverns had survived everything and would likely survive whatever came next. They forgot the numbers. They forgot the faces. Forgetting was not disrespect. It was functional. Life resumed without enthusiasm. That lack of enthusiasm was itself a form of wisdom. Londoners had learned that extremes were dangerous. Too much fear was paralyzing. Too much optimism was tempting fate. Moderation became the unspoken rule. Drink, but not wildly. Hope, but quietly. Expect little, and you will not be disappointed. Even joy returned cautiously. A good meal, a shared laugh, a song that lasted slightly longer than expected. These moments appeared without ceremony and passed just as quietly. They were not announced or celebrated. They were accepted and allowed to fade. Alcohol remained present, but now as background rather than shield. The city's noise changed. Fewer bells, more footsteps. The constant hum of survival gave way to the slower rhythm of ordinary life. Yet beneath it all, the old habits remained, ready to resurface if needed. London had learned how to endure. It kept that knowledge close. From a distance, this might look like stagnation. In reality, it was recovery in its least dramatic form. No declarations, no turning points, just days stacking on top of one another until the weight of crisis slowly dissolved. People did not notice when they stopped bracing themselves. They simply noticed they were less tired. So, when you imagine the very end of London's drunken plague era, do not imagine closure. Imagine continuation with slightly better lighting. Imagine the same tavern, the same bench, the same cup, but with fewer empty seats. Imagine conversations that drift a little further into the future than they used to. And then imagine that even this moment passed without comment. History rarely pauses to acknowledge its own transitions. It moves forward quietly, carried by people who are too busy living to name what they have survived. If your breathing is slow now, if your thoughts feel loose and unanchored, that fits. This story was never meant to sharpen the mind. It was meant to reflect a time when sharpness was a liability and dullness was protection. London endured by softening itself, by lowering the volume on fear, by accepting imperfect comforts and repeating them until repetition became stability. Alcohol was part of that, not as excess, but as habit. And so the city drifted on, slightly worn, slightly wiser, and very tired. The plague faded, the drinking stayed. Life expanded again, cautiously, without fanfare. That is where we leave London. Not victorious, not healed, just continuing, quietly. And if sleep finds you here, arriving without drama, then it is doing exactly what history did too. And with that continuation came a kind of forgetfulness that felt almost earned. Not the sudden forgetting of shock, but the slow erosion of memory through repetition. Days that resembled one another too closely to remain distinct. Evenings that ended the same way they always had. Over time, the plague stopped being something people thought about consciously. It became something their bodies remembered instead. Londoners still flinched at certain sounds, still noticed coughing a little too quickly, still preferred crowded taverns to empty streets at night. These instincts lingered long after the danger receded. Alcohol remained part of this instinctive landscape, a familiar weight in the body, a signal that the day was ending and that worrying could pause for a few hours. The city's relationship with discomfort had permanently changed. London had learned that life could remain unpleasant for very long stretches without resolving itself. That knowledge settled deep. People stopped waiting for things to improve dramatically. Improvement, when it came, was subtle. A street slightly cleaner, a room slightly brighter, a week without funerals. Expectations adjusted accordingly. Visitors sometimes mistook this restraint for coldness. Londoners were not expressive. They did not explain themselves. They did not dramatize their past. They had learned that drawing attention rarely helped. Better to keep one's head down, one's voice low, and one's cup filled just enough. In taverns, conversation drifted toward practical matters: work, weather, prices. The plague appeared only indirectly, as a reference point rather than a subject. Worse than last time. Better than before. Everyone understood what was meant. No further detail was required. Alcohol smoothed these exchanges, keeping them brief and manageable. As infrastructure slowly improved, as water became slightly safer and streets slightly less hostile, drinking habits did not immediately follow. Culture does not move at the same speed as engineering. People trusted what they had relied on before. Beer had not betrayed them. The river had. Memory guided behavior more strongly than evidence. There was no moment when London collectively decided it no longer needed alcohol as a coping mechanism. The city simply carried it forward, repurposed. What had once dulled fear, now dulled stress. What had once softened grief, now softened fatigue. The function shifted, but the habit remained. From the outside, it might appear excessive. From the inside, it felt moderate, even restrained. Londoners were not chasing pleasure. They were maintaining equilibrium. Enough to sleep, enough to work, enough to get through another unremarkable day. Eventually, the plague faded fully into history books, sermons, and statistics. Drinking stayed in daily life, stripped of its urgency, but not its familiarity. The city no longer needed it in the same way, but it no longer questioned it either. Some tools, once adopted, are never put down. So, if you imagine London at this point, there is no dramatic shift in mood, just a city that has grown used to carrying weight quietly, a population practiced in endurance, a culture shaped by long exposure to uncertainty, even when that uncertainty had finally eased. This is not a triumphant ending. It is a realistic one. Survival did not restore what was lost. It produced something different, something smaller, quieter, more cautious. London continued not because it had solved its problems, but because it had learned how to live alongside them. And that is where the story naturally thins out. Not because nothing happened afterward, but because what happened next resembled ordinary life closely enough to stop feeling like history. Ordinary life, shaped by habits formed under pressure, moving forward without commentary. If you feel yourself drifting now, that mirrors the story itself. It does not demand attention. it allows it to fade, much like the plague did, much like the fear did, leaving behind routine, habit, and a city that kept going, not loudly, but reliably. London did not emerge renewed, it emerged accustomed, and for most people living there, that was more than enough. At that point, even endurance stopped feeling like something worth naming. It simply became the default setting. London woke up, moved through the day, and went back to sleep without expecting anything in between to be remarkable. The city no longer compared itself to what it had been before the plague. Comparison required memory, and memory had softened too much for that. People still drank, but now, with even less thought than before. A cup in the hand felt as natural as shoes on the feet. Not symbolic, not emotional, just part of the arrangement. The drink did not mean escape anymore. It meant pause. A brief lowering of effort in a life that still required more effort than anyone liked to admit. The streets gradually grew busier, but not louder. Noise returned carefully, as if unsure whether it was allowed. Commerce expanded. New faces appeared. Old ones disappeared quietly. For reasons unrelated to disease this time. Death returned to its usual pace, which still felt fast, but no longer overwhelming. London accepted this without ceremony. What remained from the plague years was not fear, but caution, a reluctance to trust sudden improvement, a preference for slow change. Alcohol fit into this mindset perfectly. It promised nothing new. It did not surprise. It simply delivered the same effect it always had, which was enough. By now, the origins of these habits were irrelevant. Culture rarely remembers why it does what it does. It remembers only that doing it feels correct. Taverns stayed open. People gathered. Life continued in rooms that had once held sickness and now held only conversation and tired bodies leaning toward sleep. If someone had asked a Londoner to explain why the city drank the way it did, they likely would not have answered. Not because they were defensive, but because the question would have felt unnecessary. Explanation belongs to people who believe things could have been otherwise. London had learned not to assume that. So the story ends where most lives do, not at a conclusion, but at a settling. The plague gone, the habits intact, the city older than before, but still functioning, still moving, still quietly tired. There is no lesson neatly tied at the end, no instruction for the future, just a record of how people lived when living was difficult, and how those patterns remained long after difficulty eased. If you are still listening, you may notice that nothing dramatic happens now. That is intentional. This is the part where history becomes background, where events stop announcing themselves and start blending into routine. London's drunken plague era does not conclude with sobriety or clarity. It dissolves into normal life, carrying its habits forward without comment. A city shaped by repetition, dulled by necessity, and sustained by small comforts applied over and over again. And if this story has grown indistinct, if details have blurred together, that too is accurate. That is how it was experienced. Slowly, quietly, without sharp edges. So, let it fade. Let the city keep moving, without you watching it. History does not need an audience to continue. And if sleep arrives now, unannounced and unremarkable, then it has followed the pattern perfectly. By then, even the language people used had softened. Words like disaster and recovery fell out of everyday speech. They belonged to sermons, records, and officials, not to the rhythm of ordinary life. In homes and taverns, conversation stayed practical. Who was working? What cost more this week? Whether the weather would turn. Big ideas felt unnecessary. Small talk was safer. London's evenings settled into a dependable pattern. Lamps were lit. Doors were closed. Ale was poured with little ceremony. People sat close, not out of fear anymore, but out of habit and limited space. The warmth of shared rooms felt familiar, even comforting. Silence was not awkward. It was expected. Long pauses in conversation did not need to be filled. Alcohol, at this stage, was almost invisible. It was there, but no longer remarkable. No one counted cups. No one commented on how much anyone drank. Measurement implied judgment, and judgment implied energy. Energy was still conserved. The city preferred neutrality. The memory of sickness lived on in subtle ways. People still avoided certain houses without recalling why. Certain streets felt wrong at night. Certain smells caused unease. These reactions were inherited rather than learned. Children picked them up without explanation. This is how trauma persists when no one talks about it. Work continued under this same quiet logic. Employers did not expect enthusiasm. Workers did not offer it. The goal was completion, not excellence. Good enough was good enough. Survival had trained people out of unnecessary ambition. Alcohol reinforced this moderation. It flattened emotional highs and lows, keeping life within manageable limits. Religion regained its place slowly, but without intensity. Churches reopened fully, but attendance remained restrained. Faith, like everything else, was practiced quietly. Loud conviction felt inappropriate in a world that had proven how fragile certainty could be. Taverns, by contrast, asked nothing. They offered no answers, no promises, just a place to sit. Over time, London began to look outward again. Trade increased. News from elsewhere mattered more. The city's focus widened, cautiously. But even as horizons expanded, the internal habits remained unchanged. People still ended their days the same way. Still marked time with familiar gestures. Still trusted routine more than hope. It is easy, from a distance, to see this as emotional dullness. From within, it felt like balance. London had learned what too much feeling could do. Grief had been overwhelming. Fear had been exhausting. Alcohol, routine, understatement, these were not signs of weakness. They were tools for staying upright. Eventually, newer generations arrived who knew the plague only as a story told without detail. To them, the city's reserved nature felt normal. The drinking felt ordinary. The quiet felt natural. They inherited a culture shaped by endurance, without inheriting the memory of why endurance had been necessary. This is how history embeds itself, not in monuments, but in behavior, not in lessons, but in habits, repeated until they stop feeling like choices. London did not decide to be this way. It became this way, slowly, under pressure, and then stayed. So, when we step away from this period, there is no clear boundary where the plague era ends and something else begins. It thins out. It fades into a general sense of caution that lingers in the background. The drinking continues, no longer urgent, no longer questioned. If you were living there at this point, you would not feel like a survivor. Survivors are people who remember danger clearly. You would feel like a resident, someone who gets up, works, eats, drinks, and sleeps without attaching meaning to any of it beyond necessity. And perhaps that is the final shape of this story. Not tragedy, not resilience, but normalization, the slow transformation of crisis into background noise. The way people adjust until adjustment itself becomes invisible. London's drunken plague era does not end with wisdom gained or mistakes corrected. It ends with life becoming ordinary again, even if ordinary looks different than before. A city that learned to carry weight quietly and then forgot it was carrying anything at all. If your thoughts are fading now, if the details feel less important than the rhythm that matches the experience being described, this was not a time of sharp memories. It was a time of blur, of routine, of endurance practiced until it required no effort. So let the city recede. Let the taverns dim. Let the voices lower until they blend into background sound. History does not always leave clean edges. Sometimes it simply dissolves into the habits of people who were too busy living to mark the moment. And with that, the story becomes quiet enough to release. The city continues without needing attention. And you, like London did, can finally rest. After enough time passed, even caution relaxed into something closer to comfort. Not happiness, exactly, but a workable arrangement with the world as it was. London did not expect safety. It expected continuity. That expectation proved easier to live with. Days unfolded without urgency. People woke, worked, ate, drank, and slept in patterns so familiar they barely registered. The city no longer felt like it was recovering from something. It felt like itself again, though that self had been subtly altered, quieter, less reactive, more inclined to endure than to improve. Alcohol remained part of this equilibrium, but now it functioned almost like furniture, always there, rarely noticed unless missing. A tavern without drink would have felt unfinished, like a room without a door. Drinking did not interrupt the day. It fit around it, a pause, not an escape. Conversations stayed modest. People talked about what needed doing tomorrow, not what might happen next year. Long-term thinking existed, but it was practical rather than hopeful. Save a little, repair what breaks, keep routines intact. Grand plans belonged to people who had not lived through years where plans dissolved overnight. The city's mood settled into understatement. Joy was allowed, but not emphasized. Grief was acknowledged, but not explored. Everything stayed on the surface, where it was manageable. Alcohol supported this surface living. It kept emotions from sinking too deep or rising too sharply. A steadying influence, even when it dulled. Londoners became experts at distraction. Not entertainment in a modern sense, but mild occupation, a card game, a quiet song, watching the street from a bench. These activities did not demand much attention. They filled time without filling the mind. Taverns provided space for this kind of gentle distraction, which was often all anyone wanted. Even celebrations followed this pattern. Births, marriages, holidays passed with restrained acknowledgement. A drink was shared, a meal improved slightly. Then life returned to normal. Excess felt unnecessary, even risky. The city had learned that extremes attracted trouble. As the years layered over one another, the plague receded further into abstraction. It became something that happened long ago, even to those who had lived through it. Memory softened under routine. The past lost its sharpness. People stopped measuring their lives against it. What remained was a city comfortable with repetition, comfortable with sameness, comfortable with days that did not demand interpretation. London did not strive to feel better. It settled for feeling stable. Alcohol played its part quietly, reliably, without asking to be reconsidered. From the outside, this might look like stagnation. From the inside, it felt like peace of a particular kind. Not the peace of safety, but the peace of predictability. You knew what the day would ask of you. You knew what you would give. That knowledge mattered more than optimism. Children born into this London inherited its calm reserve. They learned early that excitement was optional, but routine was essential. They drank small beer because everyone did. They gathered indoors because that was where life happened. The reasons were never explained, because explanation was unnecessary. If anyone tried to mark the end of the plague era officially, the city did not respond. London did not recognize deadlines like that. It moved according to habit, not declarations. One day simply resembled the next closely enough that the crisis stopped feeling current. And so the story does not end in any formal sense. It simply loses urgency. The plague becomes history. Drinking becomes culture. Endurance becomes personality. The city continues, shaped by what it lived through but no longer defined by it. If you imagine yourself there now, you would not feel tension. You would feel weight, but a familiar one, like a coat you have worn for years, slightly heavy, slightly uncomfortable, but trusted. Removing it would feel stranger than keeping it on. So London went on, working, drinking, sleeping, repeating. Not because it had solved anything, but because repetition itself had become a solution. Life did not improve dramatically. It stabilized. And for a city that had learned how quickly things could collapse, that was enough. If this feels like the story is thinning, losing detail, drifting into background, that is intentional. That is how the people living it experienced it. History stopped feeling like history and started feeling like life again. And life, most of the time, does not announce itself. It hums quietly. It repeats. It carries on without asking to be remembered. So let the sound lower now. Let the details blur. The city does not need to be watched anymore. It knows what to do. And if you find yourself easing into rest at this point, that follows the pattern exactly. London survived by learning how to go on quietly. And sometimes, the quietest continuation is simply sleep. By this stage, even the idea of survival had lost its shape. It was no longer something achieved or threatened. It was simply assumed until proven otherwise. London did not wake up each day grateful to be alive. Gratitude requires contrast, and contrast had worn thin. People woke because they had woken the day before. That was reason enough. The city's pace reflected this acceptance. Nothing hurried unless it had to. Nothing lingered unless it was convenient. Time moved evenly, marked by meals, work, drink, and sleep. Alcohol continued to fit into this rhythm without comment. It did not interrupt the flow. It padded it, a slight softening between effort and rest. Taverns aged along with their patrons. Benches grew smoother. Floors dipped where feet had stood for decades. Walls absorbed smoke, sound, and memory until they felt permanently dim. These spaces did not invite reflection. They encouraged sitting. Sitting led to drinking. Drinking led to silence. Silence led, eventually, to sleep. People learned to value this progression. It was reliable. After years when nothing had been reliable, reliability felt like luxury. Not comfort exactly, but relief from uncertainty. Alcohol did not solve problems. It helped make them wait until morning. Most problems, people learned, looked different after rest, even if they remained unsolved. The city's emotional range stayed narrow. Londoners avoided extremes instinctively. Too much excitement felt reckless. Too much despair felt exhausting. The middle ground was safer. Alcohol supported this middle ground by keeping feelings from drifting too far in either direction. A steady dullness replaced sharper sensations, and that dullness felt manageable. When illness appeared again, as it inevitably did, it was met with resignation rather than panic. People adjusted routines slightly, drank a little more, stayed indoors a little longer. Life compressed, then expanded again when danger passed. The plague had taught the city how to contract without breaking. Stories from the worst years were still told occasionally, but without detail. Names were omitted, timelines blurred. What remained were impressions: darkness, quiet streets, full taverns, empty houses. These stories were not meant to warn or instruct. They were reminders that things could get worse, and yet the city had continued anyway. That knowledge lingered beneath everyday life like a low hum. It did not dominate thought, but it influenced behavior. People saved energy, chose familiarity, avoided unnecessary risk. Alcohol fit neatly into this worldview. It offered predictability in a world that had once lacked it entirely. As generations passed, this sensibility hardened into character. London became known for understatement, restraint, and a certain emotional distance. These traits were often mistaken for coldness. In reality, they were habits formed under pressure and kept because they worked. The plague did not leave monuments in the way wars sometimes do. It left patterns, ways of speaking, ways of gathering, ways of ending the day. Alcohol was woven through these patterns so thoroughly that removing it would have required unraveling much more than anyone was willing to disturb. So the city carried on, not as a place recovering from disaster, but as a place shaped by it. The shaping was subtle. It lived in timing, tone, and expectation. London did not expect things to improve dramatically. It expected them to remain tolerable, which felt like a reasonable goal. If you were there, at the very end of this long adjustment, you would not feel like you had witnessed history. History implies importance. You would feel like you had lived through a sequence of ordinary days that happened to include extraordinary loss, handled quietly and without ceremony. And when you sat down in the evening, cup in hand, body tired in a familiar way, you would not think about why things were done this way. You would not trace habits back to their origins. You would simply follow them, because following them was easier than questioning them. That is often how the past survives, not through stories loudly retold, but through routines quietly repeated. The plague faded. The drinking remained. The city settled into itself and stopped paying attention to how it had arrived there. If this account feels like it is dissolving now, becoming less distinct, that mirrors the experience it describes. The further the crisis moved into the past, the less clearly it was held in mind. What remained was rhythm, pattern, habit, and with habit came rest. Not deep, peaceful rest, but enough. Enough to close the eyes, enough to let the day end without resistance, enough to begin again tomorrow. London did not need a conclusion. It did not need resolution. It needed continuity. And continuity, once achieved, did not ask to be narrated. So we allow the story to thin, to quiet, to slip into background. The city continues on its own now, as it always did, and you, having listened long enough, do not need to follow it any further. The lights are low, the noise has faded, the pattern holds. That is enough. By now, the city's rhythm was almost automatic. Days and nights passed with little thought given to what had come before. The plague, once a sharp intrusion, was now a shadow that barely touched conversation. People moved through familiar motions, waking, working, eating, drinking, sleeping. Habit replaced vigilance. Routine replaced fear. Evenings settled into quiet predictability. Taverns filled and emptied with measured steadiness. Cups were lifted and set down with the same care as brushing hair or fastening a cloak. People did not count them. They did not remark on them. They simply existed as part of the day, as furniture exists in a room. Alcohol softened the transitions, just enough to make life tolerable without demanding attention. Life in homes and streets followed similar patterns. Children learned what to expect. Adults adapted without discussion. Work was done with minimal fuss. Conversations were practical, brief, and rarely strayed into speculation. The city had grown wary of extremes. Laughter, grief, fear, each was muted by default. Alcohol helped maintain this steady emotional balance. The passage of years blurred the edges of memory. Stories of outbreaks and suffering were told without dates, without names, without intensity. They existed only to mark that the city had endured. Facts mattered less than impression. The lessons were encoded in behavior rather than speech. Everyone knew how to behave, even if no one could explain why. Even as improvements slowly arrived, cleaner water, better sanitation, modest rebuilding the habits persisted. Alcohol remained embedded in daily life, a benign and unquestioned companion. It no longer existed to ward off disease. It existed because it had always existed. Routine outlasts purpose. Comfort outlasts crisis. The city's mood was quiet. Ordinary life resumed without fanfare. The extremes of emotion had been trained out. Anticipation, joy, and sorrow were all moderated by repetition. People moved through their days with calm efficiency. A cup in hand, a place to sit, and a bed awaiting at night were enough. Continuity mattered more than excitement. And so, the Drunken Plague era's legacy was subtle. Not in monuments, not in proclamations, but in daily habits, in the quiet endurance of ordinary life. London continued, shaped by the crisis but not defined by it. People survived, adapted, and passed those adaptations forward, generation to generation. For those who lived through it, survival did not feel like triumph. It felt like routine. It felt like existence. Quiet, measured, unremarkable existence. And that is precisely how London endured. Not through heroics, not through miracles, but through repetition, habit, and the faint comfort of a cup held in steady hand. And now, if your eyes are heavy, if your thoughts drift towards sleep, that too is fitting. The story has slowed, thinned, and quieted in rhythm with the city it describes. Life carried on. The city carried on. And now, quietly, you can do the same. By this point, even reflection had faded into habit. People no longer consciously considered what had passed or what might come. Days were measured by small, predictable actions: rise, work, eat, drink, rest, sleep. The city had learned that planning beyond immediate needs was a luxury it could not reliably afford. Habit had become the guiding principle, quiet and unremarkable. Taverns, once venues of frantic coping, had become extensions of daily life. Cups were lifted and set down with automatic rhythm. Conversation flowed only as necessary. Laughter, if it appeared, was brief and measured. Alcohol no longer served as a shield against fear. It merely smoothed the edges of the day, reducing friction, dulling anxiety, and making monotony tolerable. Homes and streets followed the same quiet logic. Children observed and learned, adults moved through routines without comment, and everyone carried on with the implicit understanding that life's rhythm was enough. Extremes joy, grief, or panic were muted. Continuity, above all, mattered. Memory of the plague lingered faintly, more as instinct than as story. The city remembered what had been necessary to endure, not what had been tragic. Actions, habits, and routines preserved the lessons. Over time, alcohol remained embedded, its presence normalized, no longer urgent, just expected. Even with gradual improvements in sanitation, water, and building, behaviors persisted. The patterns of survival outlasted their original purpose. A cup in hand, a seat at a table, a bed at night. These small constants shaped life far more reliably than fear or disease ever had. London's quiet endurance, its muted rhythm, became cultural. People navigated the city with careful predictability. Conversations stayed practical. Work continued efficiently, but without flair. Life had learned moderation. Alcohol was simply a part of that equilibrium, a tool integrated into routine. For those living in this post-crisis world, Survival felt ordinary, not heroic. It was simply living, persistent, measured, and steady. And in that ordinariness, London persisted too slowly, quietly, and without fuss. Now, as the story comes to its final quiet cadence, let your mind follow the city's rhythm. Nothing dramatic remains. No warnings, no celebrations, no turning points. Just repetition, habit, and the subtle, persistent continuity of life. London carried on, as did its people, its habits, and its quiet routines. And, if your eyelids are heavy, drifting towards sleep is exactly the kind of ending this story deserves. The city endured, and now you may rest as it did, slowly, quietly, and without disturbance. And so, in the end, London's drunken plague era left behind little that could be sharply defined. Streets remained, taverns remained, routines remained. The people who survived carried habits forward almost unconsciously, teaching them to their children not through instruction but through repetition. Drinking at certain hours, sitting in familiar corners, avoiding unfamiliar routes, these were the echoes of a city that had endured more than it had ever intended to endure. The city itself had changed, subtly. It was quieter in tone, more measured in pace, less prone to extremes. Residents no longer reacted with alarm at every cough or unusual smell. The lessons of fear had been internalized and transformed into habits of caution. Alcohol, once a shield against immediate threat, became a quiet companion to daily life, a marker of routine rather than a tool of survival. Work and commerce continued, modest and deliberate. Children grew up understanding rhythm rather than danger. Adults moved through the city with an instinctive knowledge of how to manage fatigue, loss, and uncertainty. Conversations were practical. Joy and sorrow were muted. Even when the world offered a reason to panic, Londoners had learned to carry on with gentle steadiness, trusting habit to sustain them. Time itself smoothed. Days and nights blended. Weeks became months. The plague became background noise in the memory of a population more interested in making it through another day than in examining the past. And as the years passed, the city's quiet endurance crystallized into culture. The habits forged in crisis outlasted the crisis, becoming unremarkable, ordinary, and accepted. From a distance, this may seem anticlimactic. There is no hero, no dramatic resolution, no sharp ending. From within, it felt adequate, predictable, manageable. That is how London survived, not through brilliance or luck, but through repetition, habituation, and the subtle assistance of a cup held steadily in hand. And as we let this story finally settle, there is no grand finale, just the continuation of quiet life, the ebbing of fear into routine, the persistence of habit over circumstance. London endured, softly, slowly, and without fanfare. And now, perhaps, it is time for you to drift the same way the city did, gradually, quietly, and entirely at your own pace. By now, even the weight of memory had grown soft. The events of the plague years lingered like a faint echo, felt more than spoken. The city had learned not to announce its endurance, and the people had learned not to expect more than the rhythm of daily life. Work, meals, drink, sleep. These simple repetitions stitched together the days, carrying the city forward with quiet persistence. Taverns remained, but they were no longer places of urgency. They were extensions of ordinary life. A seat, a table, a familiar mug. Conversation moved only as far as necessary, rarely drifting into speculation or reflection. Laughter existed in measured doses. Silence was tolerated and even expected. Alcohol did not disrupt the day. It softened it. It was a cushion beneath ordinary effort, ensuring continuity without excitement. Homes were similarly subdued. Families moved through routine with minimal commentary, teaching children through example rather than instruction. Habits of caution, avoidance, and modest indulgence became second nature. The city's collective behavior was a product of survival, passed from one generation to the next, almost invisible in its consistency. Even as infrastructure improved and mortality slowly decreased, the habits remained. Drinking persisted, embedded into daily life, not for necessity, but for familiarity. The rhythm of existence, wake, work, eat, drink, sleep, was enough. Continuity mattered more than ambition or joy. The lessons of survival were quiet, internalized, and habitual. Emotional extremes had been muted. Grief, fear, joy, they existed only in measured doses. The city's inhabitants had learned to live without drama. Alcohol helped maintain this balance, flattening highs and lows, enabling ordinary life to continue despite the memories of extraordinary loss. The plague receded further into history, becoming abstract, almost mythic. People remembered only the faint outlines: empty streets, crowded taverns, quiet fear, and the constant presence of drink. The city's culture, its reserve, moderation, and subtle resilience, was the true legacy of those years. Habit replaced vigilance, repetition replaced panic, and life continued. For those living through it, survival was not heroic. It was routine. It was the simple act of continuing day after day, performing the same small gestures, maintaining equilibrium, and keeping the city moving without fanfare. That quiet endurance became the defining feature of the era. London's drunken plague era did not end dramatically. It faded into the ordinary, leaving behind a city shaped by its past but no longer defined by it. The streets, the taverns, the patterns of life all persisted, quietly, rhythmically, and unremarkably. And if, by now, your eyelids feel heavy and your mind begins to drift, that is precisely the way this story was meant to be absorbed. Slowly, softly, without urgency, London endured, and now you may, too. Eventually, even the faint traces of panic disappeared. The city no longer woke with sharp awareness of disease lurking in every corner. The routines that had been forged in fear now persisted simply because they worked, because they were familiar, and because life itself had slowed to a pace that allowed survival without constant attention. Wake, work, eat, drink, sleep, repeat. Evenings in taverns became unremarkable. People sat with their mugs, speaking only as much as needed. Laughter appeared in small amounts. Conversation stayed practical, and silence was as valued as speech. Alcohol no longer acted as a protective buffer against danger. It was simply a familiar presence, marking the flow of the day and smoothing the edges of fatigue. Homes mirrored this subdued rhythm. Families moved through daily life with quiet efficiency. Children absorbed habits without explanation. Adults continued routines because deviation offered no advantage. Habits of caution and restraint had become instinctual, shaping behavior without conscious thought. Slowly, improvements in sanitation and infrastructure began to arrive, yet the habits persisted. Drinking remained a normalized part of life, embedded into culture rather than necessity. The patterns of survival had outlasted the crisis. Continuity mattered more than relief, and habit replaced vigilance. Emotional extremes had little place. Grief, fear, joy, they existed only in controlled doses. The city and its people had learned to maintain a steady balance. Alcohol aided that balance, flattening highs and lows, allowing life to continue quietly, predictably, and without incident. Over the years, the plague faded from living memory, leaving behind routines, culture, and subtle caution. The city's quiet endurance, the unremarkable rhythm of ordinary life, became its defining legacy. London had survived, not through heroics or dramatic interventions, but through repetition, habit, and subtle resilience. For those experiencing this post-plague normality, survival was mundane. It was not celebrated. It was lived. Small, deliberate gestures, repeated day after day, were enough. The city persisted in measured, patient continuity. London's drunken plague era did not end with fireworks or fanfare. It dissolved into the mundane. Streets, taverns, and habits continued, quietly, with the faint shadow of history lingering just beneath the surface. Life carried on, steady, rhythmic, and unremarkable. And now, as your thoughts slow and your attention softens, that is exactly how this story was meant to settle. Gradually, quietly, and without drama. London endured, and in its quiet persistence, you may now drift toward rest in parallel. Time continued to pass without fanfare. Days, weeks, and years layered over one another, almost indistinguishable except for the slow accumulation of small changes. The city had become a machine of habit. People rose, worked, ate, drank, slept, and repeated. Each day, a muted echo of the last. Fear no longer dominated their attention. Routine, had softened its edges. Taverns operated as quiet anchors. They were not lively or raucous. They were familiar. People entered, lifted their mugs, spoke sparingly, and left when necessary. Alcohol no longer masked terror, it provided rhythm. Each sip marked the passage of time, smoothing the transitions from one small task to the next, allowing the city to function without sudden panic. Homes reflected the same subdued patterns. Families navigated their days with quiet efficiency. Children absorbed habits without questioning them. Adults adhered to routines because it was practical, because it worked, because deviation offered no measurable benefit. The city's cautious habits became instinctual. Improvements in water and sanitation arrived gradually. Mortality slowed. Streets cleaned incrementally. But habits forged under crisis persisted. Drinking remained, not for survival, but because it was familiar, reliable, and comfortable. Continuity mattered more than novelty, and habit replaced vigilance as the guiding principle. Emotions were tempered. Joy, grief, and fear existed only in small doses. Londoners had learned that extremes were costly, inconvenient, and often futile. Alcohol helped maintain this moderation. It flattened highs and lows, keeping the city's daily life manageable, predictable, and quietly resilient. The plague faded from memory. Stories circulated, but they were vague, stripped of dates and names. The true legacy was not tragedy, but endurance, habits and routines carried forward by generations who had lived through disruption and adapted silently. London survived not through heroism or grand acts, but through repetition, patience, and subtle constancy. Life in post-plague London felt ordinary. Survival was not celebrated, it was expected. Daily acts rising, working, eating, drinking, sleeping were enough. Continuity and habit shaped existence. History was embedded in behavior rather than in words, quietly persisting in the rhythms of daily life. The drunken plague era did not end dramatically. It dissipated, leaving the city functional, habituated, and emotionally measured. Streets, homes, and taverns persisted. Alcohol persisted. Routines persisted. The city moved forward, not loudly, not visibly, but steadily, reliably, and quietly. And now, as your mind softens and your focus drifts, this story mirrors the experience it describes. Gradually, repetitively, without drama, London endured, and in its quiet persistence, you too may let yourself drift toward rest, carried by rhythm, habit, and the gentle weight of unremarkable continuity. By this stage, even the faint memory of crisis had become background noise. London no longer woke with sharp awareness of danger. The routines that had once been forged in fear now existed independently, carried forward, simply because they worked and because they were familiar. Wake, work, eat, drink, sleep, repeat. Habit replaced vigilance. Continuity replaced panic. Taverns remained central, though unremarkable. People entered, lifted their mugs, spoke just enough, and left. Alcohol no longer acted as a shield from fear. It was simply part of the rhythm of life, marking time, softening fatigue, and smoothing transitions between tasks. Silence was as common as speech and equally valued. Homes mirrored this quiet order. Families moved through their days with predictable efficiency. Children learned habits by watching adults, without instruction. Adults performed routines because it was practical. Caution, moderation, and subtle restraint had become instinctual. Even as sanitation slowly improved and mortality gradually declined, habits persisted. Drinking continued, embedded into culture rather than necessity. Patterns of survival outlasted the crisis that created them. Life no longer required constant vigilance. Repetition and habit were sufficient. Emotion remained muted. Grief, joy, and fear were all tempered. The city had learned that extremes demanded energy and offered little reward. Alcohol supported this equilibrium, flattening highs and lows and enabling ordinary life to continue steadily, predictably, and quietly. The plague receded from immediate memory, leaving routines, behaviors, and cultural temperance as its legacy. London endured, not through heroics or dramatic interventions, but through repetition, habit, and subtle resilience. Survival became ordinary. Life became routine. The city persisted, quietly and unremarkably. Stories of the era persisted only faintly. names and dates blurred. The impression remained, a city shaped by endurance, adapted into habit, moving forward without ceremony. Taverns stayed open, streets remained walked, work continued, life carried on. The drunken plague era ended not with a declaration, but by fading into ordinary rhythm. The city had learned to endure, and the people had learned to live alongside that endurance. Alcohol remained part of life, no longer urgent, but familiar. Habit became culture. Continuity became identity. And if your eyelids feel heavy now, drifting as the story thins and quiets, that is exactly the intended rhythm. London persisted, softly and steadily, through routine, habit, and quiet resilience. And now, you may do the same, slowly, quietly, and without disturbance.